Hunger doesn't roar, it scrapes. It hollows out a man's ribs with a dull, rusted spoon until the cold rushes in to fill the empty spaces. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 8 months. He hadn't washed in 3. When she opened the farmhouse door, lantern light spilling over his filthy, frozen boots, he expected the crack of a Winchester. Instead, the exhausted woman in the faded apron looked at his hollow face, sighed, and asked the one question that broke him. Harlan didn't come down from the high ridges because he wanted company. He came down because the snow had turned to ice, sealing the elk herds in the deep timber, and his snare lines had yielded nothing but frozen pine needles for 2 weeks. The wind off the Continental Divide tasted like pulverized rock. It bit through his buffalo coat, finding the seams where the heavy thread had rotted away. His right boot had a crack in the sole, letting the wet snow pack against his heel. He was 38, but his knees ground together with the dry friction of an old man's joints. He smelled of rancid bear grease, wood smoke, and the sour musk of his own unwashed skin. He saw the smoke before he saw the cabin. It was a thin, grey thread unraveling against the bruised purple twilight. It was a fool's homestead, built too close to the creek bed and backed against a ridge that funned the north wind straight down its chimney. But there was a barn, a leaning, weather-beaten structure of unpainted pine boards. Harlan didn't want the house. He wanted the hay in the barn, and maybe a stray egg if the hens were careless. He moved through the brush with the heavy, deliberate silence of a predator, conserving its last ounces of fat. His Sharps rifle was slung across his back, heavy as a corpse. When he reached the barn, the wind abruptly died, leaving a ringing silence in his ears. He slipped his scarred fingers around the iron latch, pressing his thumb against the cold metal to keep it from clanking. The door groaned. It was a miserable, high-pitched squeal. Harlan froze. He flattened his massive frame against the rough wood, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He waited for a shout, for the bark of a dog. Nothing came. He slipped inside. The air was warmer here, thick with the smell of dried alfalfa, horse sweat, and old manure. He found an empty stall and sank into the corner, pulling a pile of loose hay over his legs. He closed his eyes, the gnawing in his gut twisting into a sharp, localized pain. He would sleep, find something to steal in the grey light of dawn, and disappear. A sharp scrape of boots on gravel. Harlan's eyes snapped open. The heavy barn door swung wide. A lantern swung into the darkness, casting long, erratic shadows across the dirt floor. He didn't reach for his rifle. The space was too tight, and he was too slow with the cold. He drew the heavy hunting knife from his belt, the bone handle slick with his own sudden, cold sweat. "I know you're in here," a voice said. It was a woman's voice. It wasn't shaking. It sounded annoyed, flat and rough around the edges, like dragging a thumbnail across dry canvas. Harlan didn't move. "The horses are restless, and the latch on this door hasn't squeaked since Tuesday because I oiled it," she said. The lantern raised higher. The yellow light caught the glint of his knife blade. She stepped fully into the barn. She wore a heavy wool shawl over a faded cotton dress. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical knot, though strands had escaped to cling to her damp forehead. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding an iron pitchfork, its tines resting casually but firmly against the dirt. Harlan remained in the hay, a large, dark mass of fur and leather. He lowered the knife, resting the blade against his knee. "I ain't here to hurt you," Harlan rasped. His throat was so dry the words tore on the way up. It was the first time he had spoken aloud since August. The woman studied him. She didn't look at his size, or the menacing knife, or the wildness of his untrimmed beard. She looked at the hollows beneath his cheekbones. She looked at the way his shoulders slumped beneath the heavy coat. "You look like hell," she stated. Harlan blinked. The bluntness of it caught him off guard. He was used to fear. He was used to disgust. He wasn't used to a dry, clinical assessment. "Snow's deep," he managed to say. She stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. The wind outside began to pick up again, rattling the loose boards of the barn roof. The temperature was dropping fast. If he stayed out here, even in the hay, the frost would take his toes by morning. She lowered the pitchfork, letting it lean against the stall partition. "Have you eaten?" she asked. The question hung in the dusty air. It wasn't offered with a smile. There was no pity in her eyes, just a grim, exhausted recognition of a biological fact. Harlan's pride, a rigid, brittle thing that had kept him alive on the mountain, flared up. He opened his mouth to tell her to leave him be, but his stomach cramped violently, forcing a low, involuntary grunt from his throat. "Come inside," she said, turning her back to him, "before you freeze to death, and I have to drag your carcass out of my barn." She didn't wait to see if he followed. She just walked out into the wind, the lantern swinging. Harlan sat there for a moment, the knife still in his hand. He sheathed it, the leather scuffing against his thigh. He forced himself up, his knees popping in the quiet, and followed the swinging yellow light toward the scent of wood smoke. The heat inside the cabin hit him like a physical blow. It was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of scorched iron from the stove, boiling onions, and the faint, acrid tang of lye soap. Harlan stood awkwardly just inside the threshold, the door shut firmly behind him. He felt enormous. The cabin was small, consisting of one main room and a curtained-off sleeping area. Everything was ruthlessly organized. The cast-iron skillets hung in descending order of size. The firewood was stacked with geometric precision. A single rocking chair sat beside the stove, a frayed, half-knitted blanket draped over its back. He didn't know what to do with his hands. Melted snow was already dripping from his coat, pooling on the scrubbed pine floorboards. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of panic. He was trapped in a box. "Take the coat off. You're making a puddle," she said, not looking at him. She was at the stove, lifting the lid off an iron pot. A cloud of steam rose, carrying the heavy scent of salt pork and dried beans. Harlan fumbled with the wooden toggles of his buffalo coat. His fingers were stiff and clumsy. He finally got it off, holding the massive, heavy garment awkwardly in his arms. The smell of his unwashed body was suddenly very loud in the warm room. He was acutely aware of the grime caked under his fingernails and the blood from a butchered rabbit permanently stained into the knees of his canvas trousers. "Hang it on the peg by the door," she instructed, pointing with a wooden spoon. He obeyed. "Sit." She pointed to a ladder-back chair tucked beneath a small square table. Harlan approached the table like a skittish horse. He pulled the chair out. It scraped loudly against the floor. He winced. He lowered himself onto the seat. The chair creaked ominously beneath his weight, the dry wood protesting the sudden burden of 240 pounds of muscle and bone. He sat rigidly, his back straight, his large hands resting flat on his thighs. She brought over a tin plate and slapped it down in front of him. It was piled high with beans, chunks of grey pork, and 2 thick slices of dense, dark bread. Harlan stared at the food. The saliva flooded his mouth so fast it choked him. He reached for the wooden spoon she dropped next to the plate, his hand trembling slightly. He tried to eat slowly. He tried to remember the manners his mother had beaten into him 3 decades ago in Missouri. But the first bite broke him. The hot, salty fat hit the back of his throat, and the animal took over. He hunched over the plate, shoveling the food into his mouth, barely chewing. He didn't look up. He didn't breathe between bites. The bread was used to wipe the tin plate clean until it shone. It took less than 2 minutes. When he finally stopped, his chest heaving, the plate spotless, he realized the cabin was completely silent. He looked up, expecting to see horror on her face. She was sitting in the rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap. She had a needle clamped between her lips and was threading a piece of coarse thread through the eye of a needle. She wasn't looking at him. She was focused entirely on her task. "There's water in the pitcher," she mumbled around the needle. "Pour yourself a cup." Harlan swallowed hard. The shame crept up the back of his neck, hot and prickly. He poured the water, his hand steadier now. The tin cup was battered, the rim dented. He drank it down in one long pull. "Name's Harlan," he said. The silence was too heavy, and he felt the sudden, terrifying need to fill it, to offer something in exchange for the pork fat currently warming his blood. She pulled the needle from her lips. Abigail. She didn't ask what he was doing out there. She didn't ask where he came from. She just started pushing the needle through the heavy fabric of a worn cotton shirt. Harlan watched her hands. They were not soft hands. The knuckles were swollen, red from cold and hard water. There was a dark bruise fading yellow on her left thumb. She wore a plain gold band on her ring finger, but it was loose, sliding up and down as she worked the needle. A widow, living alone out here. It was a death sentence, usually. "You shouldn't let strangers in," Harlan said, the words slipping out before he could catch them. "Especially men looking like me." Abigail didn't stop sewing. "You think I don't know that? Then why'd you do it?" She tied off the thread with a sharp, precise snap of her fingers, biting the tail end off with her teeth. She looked up at him then. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, like a winter sky right before it snows. "Because a starving dog is a dangerous dog," she said flatly. "A fed dog mostly just goes to sleep." Harlan felt a muscle tick in his jaw. It wasn't an insult, not really. It was just the ugly truth of survival. He was a variable she had managed. "I'll be gone at first light," he said. "Suit yourself." She tossed the mended shirt onto a pile. "You can sleep by the stove. Better than the barn. Floor's hard, but it ain't freezing." She stood up, grabbed the lantern, and walked behind the faded canvas curtain that separated her bed from the rest of the room. The rings scraped against the iron rod. The light extinguished a moment later. Harlan sat at the table in the dark. The only light came from the orange glow of the embers behind the grating of the stove. The cabin settled, the wood contracting in the cold. He laid his bedroll on the floor near the stove, leaving his boots on. He kept his knife in his hand, hidden beneath the blanket. He expected to lie awake, his senses strained for any sign of betrayal. But the heat of the fire, the heavy weight of the food in his belly, and the rhythmic, steady breathing of the woman behind the curtain pulled him down into the blackest, heaviest sleep he had known in years. Harlan woke to the sound of grinding coffee beans. He didn't startle. He opened his eyes slowly, his hand instinctively tightening around the bone handle of his knife before relaxing. The grey light of morning was creeping through the single, frost-rimed window. Abigail was at the counter, turning the crank of a small iron coffee grinder. She wore the same dress, but had tied a clean apron around her waist. Harlan sat up, his joints screaming in protest against the hard pine floor. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the thick, greasy tangle of his beard. He felt a sudden, intense desire to be back on the mountain, where the cold was simple and the silence didn't require explanation. Being inside this house, under her roof, felt like a debt he didn't know how to pay. He stood up, rolling his bedroll with tight, jerky movements. "Coffee's near ready," she said over her shoulder. "I gotta go," Harlan said. His voice was gruff, defensive. She stopped grinding. She didn't turn around. "Suit yourself." Harlan tied off his bedroll and grabbed his heavy buffalo coat. He shoved his arms into the sleeves, the stiff leather resisting his movements. He picked up his rifle. He walked to the door, his boots thudding heavy and loud. He grabbed the iron door handle. He stopped. He looked back. She was pouring boiling water from a kettle into the coffee pot. She wasn't looking at him. There was no goodbye, no expectation. He was nothing but a stray dog she had fed, leaving as predictably as he had arrived. Harlan tightened his grip on the door handle. He stepped outside. The cold hit him, sharp and clean. The sky was an iron grey, threatening more snow. The wind was already stripping the dead leaves from the scrub oaks down by the creek. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the sharp, freezing air. This was his world. He started walking toward the tree line. Every step felt heavier than the last. He thought of the loose, squeaking latch on the barn door. He thought of the way the wind rattled the loose pane of glass in the front window. He thought of her swollen, red knuckles. He stopped 50 yards from the cabin. He stood there for a long time, the wind tearing at his coat. He cursed quietly, a harsh, ugly sound. He turned around. When he walked back to the cabin, he didn't go inside. He went to the barn. He found a rusted metal file in a wooden toolbox near the horse stalls. He took the squeaking iron latch off the door, working the rusted screws loose with the tip of his hunting knife. He sat on a stump outside the barn and began to file the warped metal of the latch, smoothing the burrs that caught and screamed against the catch. The rhythmic shk shk of the file against the iron was the only sound in the yard. An hour later, he reattached the latch. He closed the barn door. It clicked shut smoothly, with only a dull, satisfying thud. He turned. Abigail was standing on the porch. She was holding a steaming tin cup. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She just held the cup out slightly. Harlan walked to the porch. He didn't go up the steps. He took the cup from her hand. Their fingers didn't brush. The coffee was black, bitter, and hot enough to scald his tongue. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. "Woodpile's getting low," Harlan said, staring at the dark liquid in the cup. "I'm fair with an axe." Abigail crossed her arms against the cold. She looked at the woodpile, then back to him. "There's a splitting maul in the shed. Handle's cracked, but it holds." "I'll wrap it," Harlan said. He drank the coffee in silence. When he finished, he handed the cup back to her. She took it, turned, and went back inside, closing the door behind her. Harlan walked to the shed. He found the maul. The hickory handle was indeed split down the middle. He pulled a length of rawhide from his pouch and spent 20 minutes binding the crack, wrapping it tight and wet so it would shrink and hold like iron when it dried. He spent the rest of the day at the chopping block. The rhythmic thwack of the steel biting into the frozen pine echoed off the ridge. He fell into a steady, brutal rhythm. Swing, split, toss. Swing, split, toss. His shoulders ached, his lungs burned, but the chaotic noise in his head, the constant, grinding pressure of survival, began to quiet. He was doing work that made sense. He was building a wall against the winter. By late afternoon, the pile of split wood had doubled. Harlan stood leaning on the maul, his breath pluming in the cooling air. His canvas shirt was dark with sweat despite the freezing temperature. The cabin door opened. Abigail stepped out, holding a wooden bucket. "Pigs need slop," she called out, "and the water trough is froze over. You'll need the heavy iron bar to break the ice." She left the bucket on the porch and went back inside. Harlan stared at the closed door. A strange, unfamiliar sensation tightened his chest. It wasn't gratitude, and it wasn't obligation. It was the sudden, shocking realization that he had a use. He wasn't just surviving. He was functioning. He drove the maul into the chopping block, walked to the porch, and picked up the slop bucket. The smell of sour milk and vegetable peelings rose to meet him. He carried it toward the pig pen, his boots crunching in the snow. That night, he didn't sleep on the floor. After he had eaten another plate of beans in silence, Abigail had pointed to the narrow cot in the corner of the room, previously covered in folded laundry. "Floor drafts are bad tonight," she said, turning her back to him to wash the dishes. Harlan lay on the narrow cot, his legs hanging off the end. The mattress was stuffed with goose down, lumpy but impossibly soft compared to the frozen ground. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind batter the log walls. He realized, with a slow, creeping certainty, that the silence in this cabin wasn't empty like the silence on the mountain. It was heavy. It was loaded with the weight of unsung grief, of sheer, stubborn endurance, and for the first time in years, Harlan didn't want to run away from it. By the third week, the snow buried the lower half of the cabin windows. It cast a permanent, bluish twilight across the floorboards. The world outside ceased to exist, reduced to a white void that shrieked when the wind tore through the eaves. Inside, the space shrank. Harlan felt it most in his shoulders. He walked with a slight hunch, instinctively trying to make his large frame take up less room. The cabin was a delicate ecosystem of routines, and his presence was a boulder dropped into a shallow creek. He learned the specific creaks of the floor. He learned to step over the warped board near the stove so he wouldn't wake her when he rose to feed the fire at 2 a.m. They barely spoke. Words were expensive calories. Breakfast was oatmeal and black coffee. Dinner was beans and salt pork. Sometimes she baked a hard, dense biscuit that tasted of ash and baking soda. Harlan ate everything put in front of him, scraping his tin plate with a relentless efficiency. His days were measured in wood and water. He chopped until his calluses ripped and bled, then calloused over thicker. He broke the ice in the trough. He shoveled a trench to the barn, piling the snow shoulder high. When the chores were done, the idle time stretched out, thin and taut as a wire. On a Tuesday, he cleaned his rifle. He sat at the small table, his massive hands working the mechanism of the sharps. The smell of solvent and heavy gun oil cut through the lingering odor of boiled cabbage. He dismantled the breech block, laying the greasy steel components out on an oily rag. His thumb traced a deep gouge in the walnut stock. Abigail was kneading dough at the counter. The rhythmic thump, push, fold of her palms against the floury board had been the only sound for an hour. She stopped. She wiped the back of her wrist across her forehead, leaving a streak of white flour against her flushed skin. She turned and looked at the disassembled weapon. "You expecting a war?" she asked. Harlan didn't look up. He ran a brass brush down the heavy octagonal barrel. "Moisture gets in, rusts the bore. A man's dead if his extractor sticks. Nobody's coming up that drawer," she said. "Not until the thaw. Don't mean I let it rot." He snapped the breech block back into place. The heavy clack of machined steel echoed sharply off the log walls. It was a violent sound in the quiet domestic space. Abigail flinched. It was a microscopic movement, just a slight tightening of the jaw, a brief pause in her breathing. But Harlan saw it. He lowered the rifle across his knees. He reached for a rag and slowly, deliberately, wiped the excess oil from his hands. "Ain't meant to scare you," he said. His voice was a low gravel drag. "It takes more than a loud noise to scare me." She turned back to the dough, punching it down with more force than necessary. Caleb used to clean his Colt at that table, kept pulling the hammer back, over and over, click, clack, click, clack. Drove me near mad. Harlan sat very still. Caleb. The ghost had a name. He didn't ask where Caleb was. The freshly turned mound in the frozen plot behind the barn, marked by a simple, unpeeled pine cross, had answered that the day he arrived. "I'll clean it in the shed from now on," Harlan said. "It's freezing in the shed," Abigail replied, her back still to him. "Just don't snap the action like you're trying to break it. The walls in here are thin." Harlan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He wrapped the oily rag around the solvent bottle. He looked at the back of her neck, where her dark hair had escaped its severe knot. She was tired. A deep, bone-hollowing exhaustion that sleep wouldn't fix. He recognized it because he felt it in his own marrow. He stood up, taking the rifle to the corner by his cot. He set it down gently. It made no sound at all. The heat of the cabin betrayed him. Out on the mountain, the freezing temperatures slowed everything down. Blood clotted fast. Rot stalled. But in the stifling, wood-smoke-heavy air of the small room, the deep scratch on his left calf woke up. It was a stupid injury. A slip of his skinning knife on a frozen elk hide 3 weeks before he found Abigail's barn. The blade had sliced through his canvas trousers and bitten deep into the muscle. He had packed it with pine pitch and wrapped it in a dirty strip of linen. He had forgotten about it. Now the leg throbbed, a hot, tight pulsing that synced with his heartbeat. He tried to ignore it. He was a man who lived by ignoring the body's complaints. But by the 4th day of the blizzard, a thin, sour sweat coated his skin. The collar of his wool shirt felt like sandpaper. His mouth tasted of old pennies. He was splitting wood in the shed. The air was frigid, but he was burning up. He swung the heavy maul. It hit the pine block off-center, glancing off with a dangerous, violent spark. The maul handle twisted in his grip, wrenching his shoulder. He dropped the tool and stumbled back, his left leg refusing to hold his weight. He went down hard in the sawdust and snow. He lay there, staring up at the splintered roof boards. His breath hissed through his teeth. The pain in his calf wasn't sharp anymore. It was a heavy, sickening pressure, as if a balloon were expanding beneath the skin. He dragged himself up, grabbing the edge of the chopping block. His vision swam, the edges turning a fuzzy, static gray. He needed to hide it. If he was a liability, she would kick him out. It was the law of the wild, and he assumed it applied to the cabin. He limped back to the house, trying to force his stride into a normal rhythm. Every step was a spike driven into his knee. He pushed the heavy door open, a blast of cold air preceding him. Abigail was at the stove, stirring a pot. The smell of boiling salt pork hit Harlan's stomach, and he gagged. He swallowed hard, clamping his jaw shut, and staggered toward his cot. He didn't make it. His left boot caught the edge of the braided rug. He crashed to the floor, taking a wooden stool down with him. The clatter was deafening. He tried to push himself up, but his arms felt like wet sand. Footsteps approached. The hem of her faded dress appeared in his blurry field of vision. "Get up," she said. "Fine," Harlan slurred, trying to roll onto his back. "Boot caught." She didn't offer a hand. She knelt beside him, her pale eyes scanning him with that same clinical detachment she had shown in the barn. She reached out and pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. Her skin was rough, but blessedly cool. "You're burning," she stated. "You smell like rotting meat." Harlan clamped a hand over his left leg. It was an instinctual animal attempt to hide the weak spot. Abigail saw the movement. She slapped his hand away. It wasn't a gentle tap. It was a hard, stinging smack that surprised him into letting go. She grabbed the hem of his canvas trousers and yanked them up over his boot. The stench hit them both instantly. The linen bandage was black with old blood and thick, yellow fluid. The flesh surrounding it was swollen tight, a violent, angry crimson that faded to a sickly purple at the edges. Red streaks spider-webbed up his shin. Abigail stared at it for a long, quiet moment. Her jaw tightened. She didn't gasp. She didn't cover her mouth. "You stupid, stubborn fool," she whispered. The venom in her voice was absolute. "Leave it," Harlan grunted, trying to pull his leg back. "It'll drain. It's going to turn gangrenous," she snapped, standing up quickly. "And I am not burying another man in this frozen dirt. I don't have the strength to dig the hole." She stepped over him and walked to the stove. She grabbed the heavy iron kettle and slammed it onto the hottest part of the iron surface. "Drag yourself onto the table," she ordered without looking back. Now, the wood of the table was cold against Harlan's back. He gripped the edges, his thick fingers digging into the undersides of the pine planks. The cabin was silent, except for the growing hiss of the kettle and his own ragged breathing. Abigail moved with a terrifying efficiency. She brought over a tin basin, a bar of harsh lye soap, a bottle of dark, unmarked liquor, and a viciously sharp paring knife she had just run over a whetstone. "Drink this," she said, holding a chipped mug out to him. It was half full of the liquor. Harlan pushed himself up on one elbow. "Don't need it. It's not for courage," she said flatly. "It's to keep you from thrashing and breaking my table. Drink it." He took the mug and downed it in one swallow. It burned like kerosene all the way to his stomach. He coughed, slamming his head back onto the table. She took a pair of heavy shears and cut the canvas of his trouser leg all the way to the knee, exposing the swollen, ruined flesh. The smell was suffocating, a sweet, sickly odor of decay. She poured boiling water from the kettle into the basin. Steam billowed up, fogging the window glass. She dropped a clean rag into the scalding water, wrung it out with her bare, calloused hands, ignoring the red heat, and pressed it directly over the hardened pitch and linen bandage. Harlan roared. It was a guttural, involuntary sound that tore from his chest. His back arched off the table. The heat was agonizing, melting the pitch and pulling at the raw nerves. "Hold still," she commanded, bearing down on the rag with her body weight. "I have to loosen the scab." He gripped the table until the wood groaned. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. He squeezed them shut. He focused on the smells, the sharp bite of the lye soap, the heavy scent of the cheap alcohol evaporating from his breath, and the faint, dusty smell of dried lavender lingering on her apron. It was a bizarre, domestic anchor in a sea of pain. She pulled the rag away. The hardened pitch came with it, tearing the wound open. Dark, corrupted blood and pus spilled down the side of his leg, pooling on the table. Abigail didn't hesitate. She poured the raw liquor directly into the open gash. Harlan's vision went entirely black. He bit down on his own lip so hard he tasted copper. His massive body seized, his boots kicking violently against the air. He tried to pull his leg away, a pure survival reflex. She leaned her entire weight across his knees, pinning him down. "Don't you move!" she shouted, the flat detachment finally cracking. Her voice was strained, desperate. "If I don't clean it out, the rot will take the bone." She picked up the paring knife. She used the tip to scrape the dead, grey tissue from the edges of the muscle. Harlan felt every scrape. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a deep, invasive violation of his body. He opened his eyes. He saw her face hovering above his leg. Her jaw was locked. A bead of sweat hung from her nose. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was looking at the infection with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Caleb died of a scratch," she said. Her voice was low now, a rapid, rhythmic chant as she worked the blade. "A rusty nail in a floorboard. Just a scratch. Took him a week to die. Screamed for 3 days. I won't hear that sound again. I won't." Harlan stopped fighting. The realization hit him, cold and heavy through the haze of the alcohol and pain. She wasn't saving Harlan the mountain man. She was fighting a ghost. She was wrestling the arbitrary cruelty of the frontier, refusing to let it win twice in her kitchen. He forced his muscles to relax. He went limp against the table, letting his breathing slow, breathing through his nose. He offered her his silence, the only thing he had to give. She finished scraping. She poured more alcohol over the raw, bleeding muscle, then packed it tightly with clean linen boiled in lye water. She bound it with strips of torn sheeting, wrapping it tight enough to stem the bleeding, but loose enough to let it drain. When she finally stepped back, she was trembling. Her hands, covered in his blood, shook violently. She turned away, walking to the wash basin. She plunged her hands into the cold water, scrubbing them with the lye soap until the skin was raw and red. Harlan lay on the table, his chest heaving. The pain had settled into a deep, dull ache, but the sick, heavy pressure was gone. The fever was already beginning to break. He turned his head. "Thank you," he rasped. Abigail dried her hands on a towel. She didn't look at him. She stared at the frost on the window pane. "I'll boil some broth," she said, her voice perfectly flat again. "You're useless to me if you can't swing an axe." She walked back to the stove. Harlan watched her. The rigid set of her shoulders, the defensive armor she wore tighter than his buffalo coat. He closed his eyes, listening to the clatter of the iron pot. He knew he wasn't going to leave when the snow melted. The fever broke on a Tuesday, washing out of Harlan in a foul, shivering sweat that soaked the thin mattress of the cot. He woke to the sound of water. Not the rushing, violent noise of a mountain river, but a persistent, maddening drip, drip, drip from the eaves. The ice was giving up. He lay still, staring at the ceiling joists. His left leg felt like a heavy block of dead wood, numb from the knee down, save for a tight, pulling itch where the gash was knitting together. He smelled old sweat, the sharp tang of lye, and the faint, dusty aroma of dried lavender. The cabin was empty. The stove was banked, radiating a low, even heat. Harlan threw off the heavy wool blanket. The cold air raised goosebumps on his pale, scarred arms. He swung his legs over the edge of the cot. His left foot hit the floorboards, and a jolt of weak, trembling pain shot up his shin. He gritted his teeth, leaning his weight onto his right side, and pushed himself up. He felt hollowed out. The muscle had melted off his frame during the 6 days he had spent drifting in and out of the fever. His canvas trousers hung loose on his hips. He hobbled toward the wash basin, his left leg dragging slightly. He poured water from the pitcher. It was freezing. He splashed it over his face, scrubbing the grease and sleep from his eyes, then grabbed the towel draped over the chair. The door banged open. Abigail stepped inside, carrying a basket of wet, twisted laundry. The cold air rushed in with her, smelling intensely of wet dirt and decaying pine needles. Spring in the high country didn't smell like flowers. It smelled like a wet grave opening up. She stopped, the basket resting against her hip. She looked at him. She didn't look surprised to see him standing, just briefly inconvenienced. "You're up," she said, kicking the door shut behind her with the heel of her boot. "Fever's gone," Harlan rasped. His throat was dry as an old bone. She walked past him to the clothesline, strung across the back corner of the room. "Good. The woodpile needs turning before the rot sets into the bottom logs, and the mud is halfway to the porch step." She began pulling damp shirts from the basket, snapping them violently in the air before pinning them to the line. Harlan watched her. He felt a strange, heavy knot tighten in his chest. A lesser woman would have offered him broth. A lesser woman would have asked him how he felt. Abigail just handed him the world back, demanding he carry his share of it. It was the most profound respect anyone had shown him in a decade. He limped to his heavy buffalo coat hanging on the peg. "I'll turn the wood. Eat first," she ordered, not turning around. "There's cold biscuits in the tin. You pass out in my yard, I'll let the hogs eat you." He ate the dense, tasteless biscuits, forcing them down his dry throat. Then he went outside. The world had turned to brown slop. The pristine white snowbanks were now grey, pockmarked mounds of slush. The ground beneath his boots was a treacherous, sucking quagmire of mud and horse manure. The glare of the weak sun off the wet ground made his eyes water. He spent the next 3 days moving slowly, rebuilding his strength. The limp persisted. The muscle in his calf had healed thick and tight, refusing to stretch fully. He didn't complain. He worked. He turned the wood. He dug a drainage trench from the barn to the creek, his boots sinking to the ankles in the heavy clay. He worked until his chest heaved and his vision blurred, letting the brutal physical labor burn the residual weakness out of his blood. A new rhythm settled over the cabin. It was no longer the defensive, silent waiting of winter. It was the frantic, muddy preparation of spring. The silence between them changed. It lost its sharp edges. They moved around each other in the small space with an unconscious choreography. When she reached for the flour tin, he instinctively leaned back from the table. When he sharpened his knife, she moved the lantern closer to his hands without being asked. One evening, he was sitting by the stove, rubbing a block of beeswax into his boots. The leather was drying out from the constant cycle of mud and stove heat. Abigail was at the table, sorting through a jar of dried seeds. The scratching of her fingernails against the glass jar was the only sound. "Ground's warming," she said suddenly. It was the first time she had spoken in 2 hours. Harlan paused his rubbing. "Creek's running high. Might flood the lower pasture. It always does." She separated a pile of beans, her eyes focused on the table. "Fence down there needs mending before I can turn the horse out. 2 posts rotted through last fall." Harlan stared at the dark, shining toe of his boot. She was doing it again, stating a problem, leaving the space open for him to fill. She never asked. "I'll cut new posts tomorrow," he said. "Lodgepole pine holds up better than spruce in the wet." She nodded once, a sharp, brief motion. "Lodgepole is fine." He went back to waxing the boot. He felt the heat of the stove on his face, the smell of the melting wax mixing with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering aroma of boiled coffee. He realized with a sudden, quiet shock that he was content. The gnawing, restless beast that usually drove him back up the mountain at the first sign of thaw was asleep. He didn't want to leave the mud. He didn't want to leave the small, stifling cabin. He looked up at her. She was illuminated by the yellow glow of the lantern, her face stark and exhausted, her hair falling out of its knot. She was a hard, uncompromising woman. There was no softness in her, no easy comfort. But as she reached up to push a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers brushed her cheek, and for a fraction of a second, her hand trembled. It was a microscopic betrayal of the iron facade, a sudden, sharp spike of grief, or exhaustion, or loneliness. Harlan looked down at his boots quickly, giving her back her privacy. He drove his thumb hard into the wax, working it into the seams. He would cut the posts tomorrow. He would dig the holes deep. He would build the fence so strong the river itself couldn't tear it down. The mud brought the scavengers. It was mid-morning, 3 weeks after the snow broke. The air was thick and humid, carrying the metallic smell of an impending rainstorm. Harlan was behind the barn, stripped to his canvas shirt, swinging the heavy maul to drive the new lodgepole posts into the wet earth. The rhythmic thwack of the wood drowned out the ambient sounds of the yard. He didn't hear the horses approach. He stopped to wipe the sweat from his eyes, leaning his weight against the rough bark of the post. The sudden silence allowed a new sound to drift over the roof of the barn, a laugh, thin, reedy, and cruel. Harlan froze. His body tensed, the exhaustion evaporating instantly, replaced by a cold, chemical rush of adrenaline. It wasn't the deep, hearty laugh of a neighbor checking in. It was the sound a coyote makes when it finds a calf separated from the herd. He dropped the maul. He didn't run. Running made noise. He moved with the heavy, terrifying grace of a predator, his bad leg forcing a slight, rolling gait as he slipped along the side of the barn. He peered around the weathered boards. 3 men sat on gaunt, mud-splattered horses in the front yard. They wore long canvas dusters, heavy with dirt and grease. Their faces were shadowed by low-pulled hat brims, but Harlan could smell them from 30 yards away. Cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of nervous sweat. Drifters. Men who had survived the winter by taking what wasn't theirs and were looking for easy spring pickings. Abigail stood on the porch. She had the Winchester rifle in her hands. She didn't have it raised. She held it across her body, the barrel pointed at the floorboards, her thumb resting dangerously close to the hammer. She looked small against the backdrop of the cabin, but her spine was rigid as an iron rod. "I told you," Abigail's voice carried across the yard, flat and hard. "There's no food to spare, and the horse ain't for sale. Ride on." The man in the center, riding a roan with a swayback, leaned forward, resting his forearms on his saddle horn. He spat a thick stream of brown tobacco juice into the mud near the porch steps. "Now, ma'am," the man drawled, his voice artificially sweet. "That ain't neighborly. A widow woman out here all alone. Must get terrible lonely. Terrible hard to keep up with the chores. We're just offering a hand. Maybe a hot meal in exchange." The two men flanking him chuckled. The sound grated against Harlan's nerves like a rusted file. "The rifle says you're leaving," Abigail said, her thumb finally clicking the hammer back. The sharp, mechanical clack echoed loudly in the damp air. The men didn't flinch. They had dealt with scared women before. They knew she likely wouldn't shoot until they crossed the threshold, and by then there were 3 of them, and only 1 of her. "You ain't gonna shoot that, sweetheart," the man on the left said, dropping his hand lazily toward the Colt, tied to his thigh. Kicks like a mule. "Break your shoulder." Harlan didn't think. The rational, human part of his brain, the part that sat at tables and drank coffee from tin cups, switched off entirely. The beast he kept buried under the buffalo coat took the reins. He stepped out from the shadow of the barn. He didn't shout. He didn't announce himself. He just walked toward them. He was a massive, terrifying figure, covered in mud and sawdust, his beard wild, his eyes flat and dead. He moved with a terrifying, silent speed. The horses sensed him first. The roan snorted, sidestepping nervously. The man on the right turned his head. His eyes widened. "Jesus Christ!" Harlan didn't give him time to draw. He reached the horse in 3 long strides. He grabbed the man by the heavy canvas collar of his duster and simply tore him from the saddle. The man hit the mud with a wet, heavy thud, the breath exploding from his lungs. Chaos erupted. The center rider yelled, spurring the roan and reaching for his pistol. The third man fought his panicked horse, struggling to draw his weapon. Harlan didn't go for his knife. He didn't want a clean kill. He wanted them broken. He spun, bringing his heavy, iron-shod boot down onto the wrist of the man he had thrown to the ground. A sickening, wet crack cut through the noise, followed instantly by a high-pitched, gargling scream. The center rider cleared leather. His pistol fired, the shot going wild, splintering the porch railing 2 feet from Abigail. Harlan lunged. He caught the bridle of the roan with his left hand, yanking down with massive, brutal force, pulling the horse's head into its chest. The animal reared, throwing the rider off balance. Harlan reached up with his right hand, grabbed the man's gun belt, and dragged him over the side of the horse. They hit the mud together. It was an ugly, desperate struggle. The mud made everything slick. Harlan tasted copper and dirt. The man swung wildly, his fist connecting with Harlan's cheekbone, but Harlan barely felt it. He was operating on pure kinetic rage. He got his hands around the man's throat. His thumbs dug into the soft cartilage of the windpipe. He was going to crush it. He felt the man's pulse fluttering frantically beneath his skin, a fragile, pathetic bird trapped in a cage. He applied pressure. The man's eyes bulged, his hands clawing uselessly at Harlan's thick forearms. "Harlan!" The voice cut through the roaring blood in his ears. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a sharp, commanding bark. "Abigail." Harlan froze. His hands were locked like iron vices, but the pressure stopped increasing. He looked up, his chest heaving, his breath tearing through his teeth. The third rider had managed to turn his horse. He wasn't shooting. He was staring in absolute horror at the giant systematically dismantling his partners in the mud. Abigail stepped off the porch, the Winchester pressed tight to her shoulder, aimed directly at the third rider's chest. "Ride," she commanded. The man didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse, throwing mud in a wide arc, and bolted down the trail, abandoning his friends. Harlan looked down at the man beneath him. The man's face was turning purple, spit bubbling at the corners of his mouth. Harlan released his grip. He stood up slowly, the mud sucking at his boots. He looked at the man with the broken wrist, who was curled in a fetal position, sobbing and cradling his ruined arm. "Get up!" Harlan rasped. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together in a dry riverbed. The man in the mud gasped for air, clutching his bruised throat. He scrambled backward, terrified, slipping in the wet clay. He grabbed his friend by the collar, hauling him up. They didn't look for their dropped weapons. They dragged themselves to the remaining two horses, pulled themselves into the saddles with frantic, agonizing effort, and rode away without looking back. Silence fell over the yard. The heavy metallic smell of rain was now mixed with the sharp stink of gunpowder, fresh mud, and raw fear. Harlan stood in the center of the yard. His canvas shirt was torn and coated in brown sludge. His knuckles were bleeding. The knuckles of his right hand throbbed where they had impacted bone. He didn't look at Abigail. He stared down the empty trail. The adrenaline crashed, leaving behind a cold, hollow shame. He had exposed the monster. He had shown her the brutal, uncivilized violence that kept him alive on the peaks. She had watched him attempt to crush a man's throat with his bare hands. He waited for the cock of the Winchester. He waited for her to tell him to pack his bedroll. He was a mad dog, and she had seen the foam at his mouth. "The rain's coming," Abigail said. Harlan didn't move. "There's blood on your face," she continued, her voice perfectly even. "Wash it off at the pump before you come inside. I just scrubbed the floors." Harlan turned his head slowly. She was already walking back up the porch steps, lowering the rifle. She didn't look horrified. She didn't look afraid of him. She just looked tired. She opened the door, stepped inside, and left it open for him. The freezing water from the pump stung his bruised cheekbone, but it couldn't wash away the heavy, sinking feeling in his gut. Harlan scrubbed the mud from his arms, his bad leg aching terribly from the sudden, violent exertion. He watched the dirty water run down the wooden trough, turning the earth beneath it brown. He had crossed a line. You don't bring the savagery of the wild to a woman's doorstep and expect her to set a plate for you. The fact that she hadn't shot him was just her practicality showing. He was still useful for heavy lifting, but as soon as the fences were mended, she would ask him to leave. He dried his hands on the rough towel hanging by the pump. He walked up the porch steps, his boots leaving wet, dark prints on the wood. He paused at the threshold. The cabin smelled of coffee and frying fat. It was a violently normal smell, completely at odds with the blood and mud outside. Harlan stepped inside, closing the door softly. Abigail was at the stove, using a spatula to turn a thick slab of bacon in the cast-iron skillet. She didn't look up when he entered. He walked to the peg by the door and reached for his buffalo coat. "What are you doing?" she asked, her back still to him. Harlan stopped, his hand hovering over the heavy fur. "I'll pack my gear. Sleep in the barn tonight. Be gone by first light." The sizzling of the bacon was incredibly loud. "Did I tell you to pack your gear?" she asked. "No." Harlan swallowed hard. "But you saw what I am. I ain't a civilized man, Abigail. I lose my head. I'm a danger." Abigail sighed. It was a long, rattling exhale that seemed to deflate her entire posture. She pulled the skillet off the heat, sliding it to the cooler edge of the stove. She turned around. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her faded apron. Her eyes, pale and clear, locked onto his. "You think I don't know what you are?" she asked quietly. You think I let a wild man into my house in the dead of winter, thinking he was a saint?" Harlan lowered his hand from the coat. "Those men," Abigail said, nodding toward the door. "They came here because I am a woman alone, because Caleb is in the ground. They didn't care about my civilization. They didn't care about my manners. They cared that I was weak." She stepped away from the counter, walking to the small table. She pulled out the ladder-back chair, the one he had nearly broken the first night, the one he had spent 2 hours repairing with glue and wooden pegs so it would hold his weight. She laid her hand on the back of it. "I don't need a civilized man, Harlan. Civilization is a luxury for towns with sheriffs and brick walls. Out here, civilization gets you killed." She looked at his bruised face, his massive, scarred hands. "I need a wall. I need a dog that bites when the wolves come to the door." Harlan felt a sudden, sharp ache in his throat. It wasn't an insult. It was the absolute, unvarnished truth. It was a binding contract offered in the bleakest, most honest terms possible. "You ain't scared of me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared of the winter," she said flatly. "I'm scared of the sickness. I'm scared of outlaws who smile before they shoot you." She pulled the chair out, the legs scraping softly against the clean floorboards. "I'm not scared of the man who fixes my fences and bleeds in my yard to protect my horses." She walked back to the stove. She picked up a tin plate, forked 2 massive slabs of bacon onto it, and piled a mountain of fried potatoes next to it. She carried it to the table and set it down in front of the chair he had fixed. "Wash your hands again," she commanded, not looking at him. "You missed a spot of mud on your wrist. Then sit down and eat before the grease congeals." Harlan stood still for a long time. The tension, the agonizing certainty of his own unworthiness slowly bled out of him, leaving him exhausted, heavy, and profoundly grounded. He didn't say thank you. The time for cheap words was gone. He walked to the wash basin, picked up the bar of harsh lye soap, and scrubbed his wrist until the skin was raw. He dried his hands, walked to the table, and sat down in the heavy wooden chair. It didn't creak. It held firm beneath his weight. He picked up the fork. Across the table, Abigail poured a cup of black coffee and set it near his elbow. She sat down opposite him with her own plate. Outside, the first heavy drops of the spring rain began to hit the tin roof, a chaotic, drumming sound that washed away the blood in the yard and turned the trail into a river. The storm was violent and cold, but inside the cabin, the air was warm, smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and quiet, unyielding survival. Harlan took a bite of the bacon. He chewed slowly. He looked at the woman across the table, her face illuminated by the lantern light, her hands steadily working her knife and fork. He wasn't going to leave. Not tomorrow. Not when the snow flew again. He had wandered the high ridges for a decade looking for silence, only to find that the only silence that mattered was the quiet agreement shared across a scarred pine table. Harlan found his anchor, not in soft romance, but in the gritty, unyielding reality of survival shared between 2 broken people. It's a reminder that sometimes the deepest bonds aren't formed through grand declarations, but through shared burdens and the quiet choice to stay when the mud gets deep. What did you think of Harlan and Abigail's unspoken contract? Did he make the right choice to stay? Or will the wild eventually call him back? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this raw, grounded West